The armed forces, no matter if it's in the United States or somewhere else around the world, all see and go through some truly odd things from time to time. Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. It's good to see you made it back for another episode. Today, I'm going to be sharing some creepy and allegedly true military horror stories. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, whether it be a military story or something else, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that truly help keep this show going on a daily basis. Now, without further ado, let's get into these creepy and allegedly true military horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. My uncle was a Navy corpsman with the U.S. Marine Corps. For those who do not know, the USMC does not have their own medical personnel. Instead, the U.S. Navy provides medical care. My uncle served with the Marines during Vietnam. He saw some rough things in that country. But this occurred after he was transferred to Okinawa. His job there was working with the explosive ordnance disposal teams, and much of Okinawa in the late 1960s was still littered with unexploded ordnance left over from the Second World War. The fighting in Okinawa between the US military and the Japanese Empire was brutal and protracted. They were still discovering old bunkers fairly frequently, and it was their job to collect all the old shells and such for safe disposal. This usually involved filling a pit with the old bombs, shells, and landmines and doing a controlled detonation. Well, after several months of this duty, a new kid fresh out of 29 Palms joined the unit. Though my uncle was at the ripe old age of 25, he was the doc or the old man of the group. This 19-year-old was a prototypical FNG, standing for effing new guy, and he was hazed a bit by the squad. Nothing too serious, mind you, but even at play, Marines can be a bit rough. The new guy was always in and out of my uncle's sick bay, getting a band-aid for this or that, mostly small scrapes and things. He began confiding in my uncle, telling him that he did not think he was fitting in well with his squad mates and was worried he was going to screw up. He was not the brightest kid, but he meant well. But how this kid ended up on EOD duty was a complete mystery. A few weeks later, the squad is called out to the countryside to look over another abandoned Japanese bunker that had been discovered recently. They were picking over the area, and a kid found a box in the brush. He called it to the sergeant's attention, who was standing nearby chatting with my uncle. The sergeant turned to tell him to mark it, but back away. Instead, the young Marine reached for it, and there was an explosion. Once the sergeant and my uncle picked themselves up off the ground, they ran over to where the Marine had been standing. Whether the box had been booby-trapped or was just full of unstable explosives, they never determined. The kid was just gone. Bloody rags and meat everywhere. About a month later, the same unit was prepping to do a controlled detonation of more collected, unexploded ordnance. I do not recall the explanation of how this happened, but apparently another team had loaded up the detonation pit with a load of bombs, covered it with soil, and left the area. It should have never happened. None of the warning signs were posted stating that this pit was loaded. As the team's vehicles approached the area, my uncle sees a Marine at the edge of the woods nearby waving them down and yelling for a corpsman. The truck stops, and my uncle grabs his bag and runs off after the figure. Once he got to the tree line, he loses sight of the Marine and calls out to him. Instead of continuing to hear the calls for a corpsman, he hears very distinctly the voice of the young Marine who died in the explosion from right behind him. "Sorry about that, Doc. Couldn't let you guys go any further." He whirls around, but nobody is there. A moment later, a massive explosion erupts from the detonation pit as the previous team sets off their charges. If their small convoy had continued, they would have been right at the edge of the pit when they went off. There was much storm and fury as multiple safety regs had been violated, and it led to a slew of new procedures to ensure that it would never happen again. As I said, my uncle saw some rough things during his time of service, but he said the only thing that gave him chills after all of that was the voice of a young Marine who had saved his unit from beyond the grave. Hi, my name is Richard, and this is a story that took place when I was in the Navy. This paranormal event happened sometime between 2006 and 2007. All that aside, let us get into this. This story takes place on the USS Trenton, LPD-14. It was an amphibious loading ship commissioned in, I believe, 1962. I could be wrong, though. I was stationed on this ship for about 1.5 years until we decommissioned it and sold it to the Indian Navy. I worked as a machinist mate in the engine room, or pit as we called it. I worked in one of the 2 engine rooms on board, one called the forward engine room and the other called the AFT engine room. The reason being as one sat a little more towards the front of the ship, hence the names forward and AFT, as well as the engine room. Each one was equipped with the main engine and shaft that ran, let us say 100 feet or so. So to support these shafts, there were huge bearings that held it in place. These sat in a place we called Shaft Alley. To gain access to this alley, you had to climb down a 30-foot ladder to reach a long dome-shaped alley that ran about 70 feet or so. Now that you understand a little bit about the ship, I would tell you the first part of this story. Back in 1962, when the ship was newly commissioned, it underwent its first cruise deployment to break in the ship, so to speak. Well, during this cruise, the AFT engine room had a major steam leak. No big deal, right? Yeah, think again. These pipes were pumping with steam at 650 psi at 900 to 960 degrees. We were always told if a major steam leak happened, we only had a few seconds to get to any emergency space hatch or we would be steamed alive like a lobster. Well, in this case, 2 bolts broke on a flange, so initially the leak was only minor and the crew decided to continue to sail and operate the boiler. Wrong decision. Shortly after, the pipe ruptured, killing several sailors. Now this is where the story gets odd, as I can verify that the previous part through research was definitely true, but I can't verify the upcoming part. Apparently, just before the pipe blew, the chief on watch had left the space for just a moment, which spared him from the horrible death his shipmates suffered. However, stricken with grief, he allegedly hung himself from a ladder in the AFT shaft alley. Now, that you understand this, please understand that everything I just told you about the steam leak and the chief hanging himself was unbeknownst to me when I arrived on the ship. I never knew any of this until after I had my paranormal experience, and I worked up the nerve to talk to someone about it. My experience starts like this. I was on a restricted, maneuvering watch inside the AFT shaft alley one afternoon. Basically, I had to sit down there and watch the shaft as the ship made various turns. If anything happened to a bearing or something else, I was supposed to report it immediately. Well, the watch could be very boring, and I had stood plenty of watch in both shaft alleys, and, honestly, it is easy to fall asleep, especially the forward shaft alley since it was dimly lit and painted dark colors, versus the bright white painted and well-lit AFT shaft alley. Regardless of this, I felt myself starting to want to drift off. However, I could not shake this feeling of being watched. At first, I shrugged it off as nothing. After a while, though, this feeling continued to grow and grow, until after letting, let's say, an hour pass, I felt that something was glaring at me from the corner of the alley. The weird part? This part of the alley, despite the bright lights and white walls, maintained a perpetual state of darkness. At this point, I felt that whatever was watching me wanted to hurt me. I could not keep my eyes off that corner and fear started to swell within me. Despite this, though, I stayed there, motionless, unblinking, watching this corner. After what felt like an eternity, I got a message through our sound-powered telephone securing me from the watch. Without missing a beat, I turned heel and ran for the ladder. As I climbed the ladder, about halfway up, I felt something latch onto my shoulders. It felt like a person grabbed my shoulders and was trying to pull me down. I could physically feel fingers digging into my shoulders. Panicking, I felt adrenaline surge through me, and I pulled and half clambered my way up the ladder and heavy heaved myself through the hatch. The craziest part? As soon as I got through the hatch, the feeling went away. Instantly, like it was never there at all. Scared, I did not speak of this to anyone for fear of being made fun of. It was not until I heard a buddy of mine talking about it that I opened up and told them about it. He told me about that accident back in the 1960s. He told me he had a paranormal experience down there too and refused to go down there ever since. This part of my life still haunts me to this day. But despite this, I love sharing it with people. My dad grew up in a small town called Lubanga, in southwestern Angola. He was born in 1961 and as a child spent most of his time in the dry open land, playing with friends and hunting with his father. Now, this story takes place on the 29th of December 1983, when my dad was 22 years old. At this point in his life, he was working for a petrol company, driving a petrol tanker around the town to various petrol stations. Now, this day started like any other, usual pickups here and there. One station, however, he parked the tanker and headed inside the station for the newspaper and a possible cigarette if he was lucky. My dad was familiar with all the different station clerks, and stepping inside this one, he was expecting to see the usual shopkeeper, Roy. But there was no one running the till. My dad assumed he was in the toilet cubicle, and he went to grab a paper. It was from the week prior, which satisfied my dad enough. Living in Lubanga during the Civil War, it was incredibly rare to get a newspaper even close to the correct date. My dad was no stranger to the Civil War raging in this country, but he tried to avoid conversation about it as it just made people upset. Unfortunately, this was borderline impossible considering it was the only excitement the old men in the town experienced. Anyway, upon reading the headline of the newspaper, South Africa troops retreat after the devastating attack. My dad placed the newspaper where it previously lay and scanned the desk for cigarettes. He spotted some rolling paper laid out across the desk with a sprinkle of tobacco already inside. My dad figured that Roy had started to roll a cigarette when something else had come up. He decided to wait for Roy to come back while he flicked through the collection of newspapers built up on the desk. After 10 long minutes, my dad decided to carry on with his job and just believe Roy had gone for a long walk or something. He was walking to his tanker as the sound of plane propellers filled the sky. This was not unseen, but it was rather unusual in Lubanga. So, my father decided to lean against the cab of his big rig and watch the planes soar by. My dad was so sad to the juxtaposition of this destructive army. With the backdrop of the beautiful Angolan sky, it just seemed like such a contradiction. The planes were flying low over the Lubanga military base, and my dad concluded there were 2 planes landing in the base after some battle of sorts. My dad's wondrous expression turned to curiosity as he saw 2 small black dots drop from the bottom of the plane. As the dots fell, my dad's face turned to dread as he watched the 2 planes fly far away. A loud explosion rattled his ears, and he fell to the ground in shock. He looked at the fire cloud that surrounded the military base and watched as it crumbled and burned. He lay there, watching for half an hour as chaos ensued in and around his hometown. That moment was the day Lubanga fell. Weeks later, they found Roy's body. It had turned out he had gone on a walk and was found by 2 South African soldiers who interrogated him on the spot. He attempted to escape and retaliate and was shot dead in the process. This was a planned attack by the South African Army called Operation Clinker, and it can be found on the internet, although sadly little information is written about it. I think this story is very, very important for people to hear, as the Angolian Civil War is an event in history that takes countless lives and isn't talked about nearly enough. I believe people need to be educated on this historical landmark. One of my great uncles was a tunnel rat for the U.S. Army Corps during Vietnam. His job was going into the tunnels after they had been cleared and setting demolition charges. So, if the VK retook an area, they could not reuse the tunnels. Most folks who have been there will tell you it's one of the most dangerous jobs you could absolutely do. He told me stories about the wild men in the jungles. They would be in the tunnels too. The VK knew of them and took many steps to avoid them and warn each other. The VK used a different variety of warning systems and booby traps. The Corps would have to find them and dismantle them before demolition. He said they would find them in areas that went deeper into the caves, where they knew there was not a close logical entry or exit point. So, they were clearly afraid and cautious of something other than the opposing military forces getting the drop on them. Some of these deeper cave areas were set up like native camps, with things constructed from natural materials, clearly not military. It makes you wonder if the VK took these areas over from the rock apes and expanded them for military use in some places. All I can clearly recall of this story is him talking about native camps and wild men. Again, these were places where the VK were cleared out, and it was the Corps' job to dismantle and destroy or reappropriate military infrastructure. Besides the tunnels, he talked a lot of the stranger, weirder things he had seen. Besides his group being followed around by these unseen wild men, the villagers would talk about these goblin, elf-like creatures. There is a name for them in Vietnamese, but I cannot recall what it is. In Spanish, they are called duende. They live near rivers apparently. Also, they would quite often see strange lights and things moving across the rice fields and through the jungles while out on patrol. Just strange and supernatural paranormal things. He never talked about the actual war or fighting. He stayed stoic about those things, but he loved talking about the other stuff. He was not prone to wild stories or exaggerated tales, just really matter of fact, this weird stuff happened and how there is a lot in this world that we do not quite understand. He died a few years back now, but he instilled in me a love for the weird and supernatural, and inspired me to do all the paranormal research and writing that I do. I am a 29-year-old female. However, at the time of these events, I was 22 to 24 years old. I joined the United States Army to help people. I have always wanted to make a difference in the lives of others. So when I got stationed out in Colorado, I was nervous but hopeful. Once I was settled into my new unit and had met my new coworkers, everything seemed to fall into place. Everything was good, until it wasn't. It started out small like most things do. Sergeant C would snatch papers right out of my hands and then accuse me of not knowing what I was doing. He would ask me to do things for him immediately, although I was already doing something for someone who was of higher rank than him, and when I would tell him, he would say, "I don't care, do what I told you to do." Eventually it progressed to something more like stalking. Sergeant C would come into work and ask me about my personal plans and appointments for the week. He would then have me ask him if I could keep these appointments or if I had to cancel them. Then, when I was able to keep the appointment, I had to write the time down on a marker board for him to see. When I went either on an appointment or to get the mail for my unit, which I did daily because I was the unit mail clerk, if I wasn't back when he thought I should be, he would call me or have a lower enlisted soldier call me and tell me to hurry up and get back. If I didn't answer right away, he would keep calling and texting me to call him back immediately. When I was at work, he would constantly hover over my shoulder watching me instead of doing his own work. He would also call me on the weekend and ask me where I was, what I was doing, and who I was with. When I started dating my husband, He came into work asking why I didn't ask his permission to date him. Again, I'm an adult woman. He would then require me to call him every single night before I would go to sleep and ask him if he needed me to do anything for him, even on the weekends. I forgot to call him, and he would call me. When getting the mail, I needed a license to drive a particular vehicle, and I had to take a class for it. I got all the required documents ready for it, but Sergeant C refused to let me take the class. So when I got mail by driving the vehicle without the proper documentation, he called me up at 8 at night in a Walgreens parking lot asking how I get mail, even though he and many others knew exactly how I was doing it. He kept repeating, "How do you get mail?" over and over until I broke down and my husband had to take the phone and talk to him. It was so bad that I would cry every night and every morning. I eventually was told to go on counseling by my captain. When Sergeant C found out that he was the reason I was seeing a counselor, he cornered me in the back of the office where no one could see, and he made me tell him that I was afraid of him and I couldn't work with him. Once, after already being in counseling for a while, my first sergeant told me that I would be going to NTC deployment training with Sergeant C, alone. I told him I wasn't sure that was such a good idea with everything that has happened, and he eventually sent someone else with him. I had many people tell me they saw Sergeant C verbally and mentally abuse me, harass me, and no one did a damn thing to stop it. I had many panic attacks and had to be admitted to the ER after a verbal altercation with him where he chased me around the office yelling. Eventually I left the Army and now work as a civilian worker for an Air Force base. However, the scars still run deep as I'm still attending counseling. I take medication and have been diagnosed with extreme anxiety and PTSD. I suffer from panic attacks and nightmares about him. One day, I fear he'll find me again. I hope that one day things like this are taken more seriously and that no one has to deal with someone like him. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true military horror stories. I don't know about you, but just the thought of joining the military itself creeps me out. I just don't think I'm cut out for that kind of stuff, but I do salute and appreciate everyone who does go and serve their country. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton in the YouTube algorithm. If you're listening on iTunes or another podcast platform, be sure to give the show a 5-star rating, as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it be a military story or something else that creeped you out, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that truly help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you're on the go and still want to listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories wherever you go, you can do so by downloading them for absolutely free from iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. And like I said, it's absolutely free and always will be. If you guys want to support the swamp outside of hitting that like button and subscribing, maybe check out the merch store. I have everything from face masks to t-shirts to hoodies and much more. Thank you guys as always for supporting the swamp the way you do. Like I always say, I couldn't do this on a daily basis without you guys sending in your stories. Once again, if you have a story you would like to share in a future video, I would love to share it. Be sure to send it in at swampdweller.net. Thank you guys, and I'll see you soon with another creepy video.